The crystal rim of the China Cup had just touched John Kennedy's lips when McGeorge Bundy's footsteps shattered the morning stillness of the White House residence. The president's national security advisor moved with an urgency that made the Secret Service agents straighten against the doorframe, their hands instinctively moving toward their holsters. Sunlight streaming through the tall windows caught the manila envelope Bundy clutched against his chest, and in that frozen moment, Kennedy knew his Tuesday breakfast would remain unfinished. The scrambled eggs grew cold on the presidential china as Bundy's face told a story his lips hadn't yet formed. Caroline's laughter echoed from somewhere down the hallway, a sound that suddenly seemed to belong to a different world entirely. Kennedy set down his cup with deliberate care, the soft clink of porcelain against saucer marking the end of something he couldn't yet name. Bundy's hands trembled as he spread the photographs across the breakfast table, pushing aside the New York Times and a half-eaten piece of toast. The images were grainy, abstract patterns of shadows and shapes captured from 13 miles above the Caribbean island, but Kennedy's trained eye needed only seconds to understand their meaning. Long, cylindrical objects arranged in star-shaped patterns, support vehicles clustered like ants around a prize. The unmistakable infrastructure of nuclear deployment. His coffee grew cold as he traced the outlines with his finger, calculating distances and blast radiuses in his head. 90 miles from Florida, less distance than his morning drive to Hyannis Port, close enough that there would be no warning time, no second chances. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked its indifferent rhythm, while Kennedy's mind raced through scenarios, each more catastrophic than the last. He looked up at Bundy, and without speaking a word, both men understood that October had just become the most dangerous month in human history. The Oval Office felt smaller than usual as Kennedy positioned himself behind the resolute desk, the morning light casting long shadows across the presidential seal woven into the carpet beneath his feet. His back ached, the old PT-109 injury flaring as it always did under stress, but he refused to reach for the rocking chair that usually provided relief. Instead, he spread the reconnaissance photographs across the polished wood, the surface anchoring their corners with a paperweight, a fountain pen, and his own trembling hands. Each image revealed a different missile site, different angles of the same nightmare, and he found himself counting the installations like a child counting monsters under his bed. The grain of the photographs blurred and sharpened as he leaned closer, searching for something that might make this intelligence wrong, a misidentification, a terrible mistake that morning coffee and fresh analysis might correct. But no amount of wishful thinking could transform those stark patterns into anything innocent. The CIA analysts had labeled each component with clinical precision: erector launchers, missile, transporters, oxidizer tanks, a vocabulary of annihilation rendered in neat typescript along the margins. Kennedy's finger traced the distance from the Cuban coast to Miami, then to Washington, calculating flight times that could be measured in minutes rather than hours. His mind conjured images of American cities he'd campaigned in just 2 years. Earlier, Atlanta, Cincinnati, Washington itself, reduced to radioactive ash before radar operators could finish shouting warnings. The abstract mathematics of nuclear deterrence, those comfortable theories discussed in war rooms and policy papers, had suddenly crystallized into this terrible geometry of vulnerability. Everything he'd built, every careful diplomatic chess move, every measured response designed to keep the Cold War cold, now threatened to shatter against these concrete launch pads hidden beneath Cuban palms. His hands steadied as he reached for the telephone, but his jaw remained clenched tight enough to ache. Through the window behind him, tourists gathered at the wrought iron fence, taking photographs and pointing at the White House with the innocent enthusiasm of citizens who still believed their greatest concerns were unemployment rates and highway construction. Kennedy watched their reflections in the glass, these ordinary Americans whose lives now hung suspended between his decisions and Soviet intentions, and felt the weight of their unknowing trust settle across his shoulders like lead. He thought of Jackie, of Caroline and John Jr. playing in rooms just down the hallway, their laughter a counterpoint to the silence screaming from these photographs. The intercom buzzed with his secretary's voice, announcing the next appointment. But Kennedy kept his gaze fixed on the images before him. Somewhere across the Atlantic, in a Kremlin office he'd never seen, Nikita Khrushchev was making his own calculations, moving his own pieces across this deadly board, perhaps believing that Kennedy could be pushed, tested, broken by pressure and proximity. The Soviet premier had smiled and made promises during their Vienna summit, assurances about defensive weapons only, peaceful coexistence, mutual respect for spheres of influence. Words that now seemed designed specifically for this moment of betrayal. The memory arrived uninvited, sharp as broken glass, cutting through Kennedy's concentration on the present crisis. 18 months had passed since that April morning when he'd received the first fragmentary reports from the beaches of southern Cuba, each transmission more desperate than the last, each plea for air support, a knife twisting deeper into his conscience. The Bay of Pigs had been sold to him as a clean operation, a surgical insertion of Cuban exiles who would spark a popular uprising against the new regime, toppling it before breakfast and validating American resolve without fingerprints. Instead, the operation had collapsed into chaos within hours, brigade men dying in the surf while Kennedy sat in these same rooms, forced to deny them the naval and air support that might have saved their lives. The assassin photographs on his desk now felt like Khrushchev's direct response to that failure, a calculated exploitation of perceived weakness, testing whether the young president who'd abandoned allies on Cuban beaches possessed the steel to risk everything over missile installations. He could still taste the bitterness of those April days, the sick realization that he'd inherited a flawed plan from the previous administration and lacked the experience to recognize its fatal assumptions. His advisors had assured him the invasion would appear authentic, that American involvement could be plausibly denied, that success was virtually guaranteed by patriots fighting for their homeland's liberation. Instead, the entire world had watched American-backed forces surrender on live television, their captured equipment bearing obvious American markings, the lies transparent and humiliating. Kennedy had taken full public responsibility with words that sounded noble in press conferences, but tasted like surrender in private moments, accepting blame while privately vowing never again to trust the confident assurances of intelligence experts and military planners. That humiliation had followed him through every subsequent negotiation, every summit with Khrushchev, every moment when Soviet diplomats smiled with barely concealed contempt at the young leader who'd stumbled so spectacularly in his first foreign crisis. Now those same Cuban shores hosted Soviet missiles, a direct challenge that transformed the previous embarrassment into something infinitely more dangerous. Kennedy understood the psychological calculation behind Khrushchev's gambit. The Soviet leader believed the Bay of Pigs had revealed a president too cautious, too afraid of escalation, too concerned with world opinion to respond with genuine force. The failed invasion had been meant to demonstrate American strength, but instead advertised vulnerability, painting a target on Kennedy's credibility that Khrushchev now aimed to exploit. Every advisor who'd promised him easy victory in April now sat in meetings urging caution, their previous confidence replaced by hedged recommendations and bureaucratic self-protection that made Kennedy trust his own instincts more than their collective wisdom. The cruel irony wasn't lost on him. His restraint after the Bay of Pigs, his refusal to compound failure with wider military intervention, had been praised by some as mature judgment, but interpreted by Khrushchev as weakness worth probing. That restraint had brought these missiles to his doorstep, transformed caution into catalyst, made his previous humiliation the foundation for this current nightmare that threatened millions of lives. Kennedy's fingers pressed against the reconnaissance. Photographs with renewed pressure understanding that whatever decision he made now would either redeem that earlier failure or compound it into catastrophe, and that Khrushchev was counting on April's ghosts to paralyze his judgment when decisive action was required. The words escaped Kennedy's lips before calculation could soften them, raw and unfiltered in a way his public persona never permitted. "He can't do this to me." The statement hung in the Oval Office air like cigarette smoke, thick with personal betrayal that transcended geopolitical chess moves and strategic calculations. Robert Kennedy stood by the window, his brother's most trusted advisor and the only person in Washington who understood that this rage wasn't simply about national security or Cold War positioning. It was about a specific, personal deception that cut through diplomatic niceties straight to the bone. Khrushchev had looked Jack Kennedy in the eye at their Vienna summit, had clasped his hand with vodka-warmed enthusiasm, had promised with grandfatherly sincerity that Soviet assistance to Cuba would remain purely defensive, nothing that could threaten American interests or force confrontation between superpowers. Those assurances had been repeated through diplomatic channels, reinforced in private correspondence, stated with such conviction that Kennedy had staked his credibility on accepting them at face value. Robert watched his brother's jaw tighten, recognizing the particular quality of fury that came from being made a fool on the world stage. "He lied directly to your face," Bobby said quietly, giving voice to the transgression that military briefings and intelligence assessments couldn't quite capture. The brothers shared a moment of silence, weighted with implications neither wanted to articulate. That Kennedy's youth, his inexperience, his Bay of Pigs stumble had made him appear manipulable in Khrushchev's estimation. The Soviet premier had calculated that this young president could be deceived, that promises made with vodka toasts would pacify American concerns, while construction crews worked through Cuban nights installing missiles that transformed the strategic balance. Kennedy's fingers drummed against his desk with controlled violence, each tap marking the rhythm of violated trust that made this crisis infinitely more personal than any abstract nuclear standoff. Every ambassador who repeated those assurances, every diplomatic note assuring us of peaceful intentions, Kennedy continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous register that Bobby recognized from childhood confrontations. The photographs scattered across the presidential desk told their silent story of systematic deception, missile sites at various stages of completion, evidence of planning that stretched back months while Soviet diplomats smiled and offered reassurances. Kennedy understood statecraft required deception, that nations lied to each other as routinely as breathing, but this felt different, more calculated, designed specifically to exploit his previous failures and test whether humiliation had made him predictable. The realization burned because Khrushchev had been partially right. Kennedy had restrained himself after the Bay of Pigs, had chosen caution over escalation, had demonstrated exactly the kind of measured response that might suggest he'd accept another fait accompli rather than risk nuclear confrontation. Bobby moved closer, recognizing that his brother needed to voice this anger privately before donning the composed mask required for the impossible decisions ahead. "So what are you going to do about it?" The question refocused Kennedy's rage into something more useful than personal grievance, transforming betrayed trust into fuel for the calculation required to outmaneuver an opponent who'd badly underestimated him. Kennedy's eyes lifted from the photographs with renewed clarity, the fury still present, but now channeled into cold determination that Khrushchev would learn his assessment had been catastrophically wrong. The cabinet room filled with faces Kennedy trusted to hold the world's most dangerous secret, 14. Men summoned without explanation, forbidden from bringing assistance or taking notes that might leak into Washington's gossip machinery. Morning sunlight filtered through windows overlooking the rose garden, creating an almost peaceful contrast to the apocalyptic scenarios about to be discussed in hushed tones around the mahogany table. Kennedy entered last, his face an expressionless mask that gave no hint of the rage Bobby had witnessed minutes earlier, carrying himself with the controlled composure of a man who'd decided his personal feelings were luxuries the moment couldn't afford. Dean Rusk sat stiffly beside Robert McNamara, both men already briefed enough to understand this. Wasn't another routine crisis requiring measured diplomatic responses. The air conditioning hummed with mechanical indifference as Kennedy took his seat, watching steam rise from coffee cups while his advisors waited for the hammer to fall. Cigarette smoke began its inevitable climb toward the ceiling, mixing with tension so thick it felt like breathing underwater. This was XCOM's birth, the executive committee that would either save civilization or witness its final chapter. Kennedy's voice cut through the weighted silence with surgical precision, wasting no words on diplomatic softening or political context that everyone present already understood. Gentlemen, the Soviet Union is installing medium and intermediate-range ballistic missiles in Cuba with nuclear capabilities. He let the statement settle like fallout, watching faces register shock, disbelief, calculation, and in some cases, a fear they couldn't quite conceal behind professional composure. McNamara leaned forward immediately, his analytical mind already constructing response matrices and strategic options, while Dean Acheson's expression hardened with the rigid certainty of a man who'd navigated previous existential crises. The photographs circulated around the table, grainy black and white images that required trained interpretation, but told an unmistakable story of deception and calculated provocation. Maxwell Taylor studied them with military precision, mentally calculating blast radiuses and response times, while others struggled to process the geopolitical earthquake these images represented. Kennedy watched his advisors absorb the intelligence, knowing each man's initial reaction would reveal whether they'd counsel caution or catastrophe. The debate erupted with surprising speed, voices overlapping as generals argued for immediate airstrikes while diplomats urged caution and verification. "We need to know if they're operational," someone insisted, but Kennedy's hand rose slightly, commanding silence without apparent effort or raised volume. His next words carried the weight of a man who'd already moved beyond shock into the dangerous territory of cold calculation. Operational or not, they're being installed 90 miles from Florida with one purpose: to fundamentally alter the strategic balance while the world sleeps. Curtis LeMay practically vibrated with aggressive certainty, convinced that overwhelming force applied immediately would solve what diplomacy had failed to prevent. But Kennedy's eyes held a different quality now, a dangerous patience that suggested he'd learned lessons from previous failures that his more hawkish advisors hadn't fully grasped. The room divided into camps before the first hour concluded. Those who saw salvation in immediate military action, and those who feared such certainty would light a fuse leading straight to Armageddon. Kennedy chain-smoked through the arguments, his silence more commanding than the passionate advocacy surrounding him, letting his advisors reveal their instincts before committing to any course that couldn't be unmade. The ashtrays filled while scenarios multiplied: blockade, invasion, airstrikes, diplomatic pressure, each option carrying consequences that branched into increasingly dark possibilities. Bobby sat apart from the main table, watching his brother orchestrate this deadly symphony with contained fury, still visible to anyone who knew him well enough to recognize the signs. The mornings stretched toward afternoon as XCOM wrestled with options that ranged from unthinkable to merely catastrophic, while outside the cabinet room windows, tourists photographed the White House in blissful ignorance. Kennedy's controlled demeanor never cracked, but his fingers drummed that same violent rhythm against the table, edge counting out the tempo of decisions that would define whether humanity had a future. When he finally adjourned the meeting without announcing any decision, the relief was palpable. One more day before choices became irreversible, one more night before words transformed into actions that couldn't be recalled. The ExCom meeting dissolved into scattered conversations and hurried departures, but Kennedy caught Kenny O'Donnell's sleeve with a grip that conveyed urgency beyond words. His oldest friend recognized the gesture immediately. This wasn't the president requesting counsel, but Jack Kennedy, needing someone who remembered him before power transformed every relationship into calculation and political theater. They walked without destination through the West Wing's corridors, past secretaries who knew better than to interrupt, their footsteps echoing against marble floors that had absorbed the anxieties of previous administrations facing their own impossible choices. O'Donnell waited, understanding that whatever was coming required privacy even the Oval Office couldn't guarantee, where hidden microphones preserved every word for posterity's judgment. Kennedy steered them toward a small side office rarely used, closing the door with careful deliberation before the mask finally cracked. The composed leader who'd orchestrated 2 hours of strategic debate vanished, replaced by something more vulnerable and infinitely more human. Kennedy's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, as though speaking the fear aloud might manifest it into terrible reality beyond their control. This could actually happen, Kenny. Not theoretical planning exercises or abstract deterrence theory, but cities burning while we count the dead in millions instead of thousands. His hand trembled slightly as he lit another cigarette, the flame wavering before catching, smoke curling upward like prayers offered to indifferent gods. O'Donnell had seen Kennedy navigate personal tragedy and political warfare with equal composure, but this was different, the weight of consequences so vast that individual courage became almost irrelevant. The afternoon light through the window cast long shadows across Kennedy's face, aging him beyond his 45 years, revealing the terrible solitude of power when decisions affect not just nations but species' survival. Khrushchev and I were two men who could stumble into Armageddon because we misread each other's intentions, or because pride won't let us back down when backing down becomes the only sane option. O'Donnell recognized this moment as confession, witnessing the private terror Kennedy couldn't share with advisors who needed to believe their president possessed certainties he didn't feel. Kennedy moved to the window, staring toward monuments built to honor dead presidents who'd faced their own crises without nuclear stakes amplifying every miscalculation. The generals want action, immediate and overwhelming, and part of me, the part that still burns over the Bay of Pigs, wants to give them exactly what they're asking for. His reflection in the glass looked ghostly, transparent, as though he were already becoming the historical figure future generations would judge without understanding the impossible positions history created. O'Donnell stayed quiet, knowing Kennedy wasn't seeking answers, but simply voicing the paralyzing awareness that no choice offered safety, only different paths toward potential catastrophe. The silence between them held decades of friendship, back to when consequences meant lost elections rather than lost civilizations, when mistakes could be survived and learned from instead of ending everything. Kennedy's next words came slowly, each syllable weighted with the recognition that had been building since. Bundy interrupted his breakfast with photographs that changed everything. If I'm wrong, Kenny, if I choose caution when action was needed, or force when patience might have worked, there's no coming back from that mistake. No second administration to correct course or learn better. O'Donnell finally spoke, his voice steady despite the apocalyptic scenarios hanging between them like smoke that wouldn't dissipate. Then you make the best choice you can with the information available, and you accept that perfect decisions don't exist when Khrushchev's sitting in Moscow, making his own calculations we can't predict. Kennedy nodded slowly, the gesture of a man accepting a burden that couldn't be shared or transferred, only carried alone into whatever came next. They stood together in that unused office while the afternoon died outside, two men from Boston who'd never imagined their friendship would require witnessing each other face the possible end of human civilization. The fear didn't vanish with confession, but speaking it aloud somehow made the weight more bearable, transforming private terror into shared acknowledgement that the days ahead required surviving doubt rather than pretending certainty. When Kennedy returned to the cabinet room the following morning, the intelligence analysts had transformed abstract threat into concrete nightmare, spreading detailed projections across the mahogany table like autopsy reports for cities still breathing. CIA Director John McCone stood beside enlarged photographs and maps marked with concentric circles representing blast radii, his voice clinically detached as he described the mathematics of annihilation with the precision of a chemist explaining molecular bonds. The SS-4 missiles currently being assembled in Cuban fields could reach Washington in 13 minutes from launch, turning the Capitol dome into vaporized marble and the Washington Monument into a shadow permanently burned into scorched earth. Kennedy's coffee grew cold in his hand as McCone's pointer traced arcs of destruction encompassing Atlanta, Dallas, Houston, American cities reduced to coordinates on targeting maps that Soviet officers were studying with equal clinical detachment 3,000 miles away. The morning sunlight streaming through the windows felt obscene against these calculations, nature's indifference mocking human civilization's fragility when confronted with weapons that made previous wars seem almost quaint by comparison. McCone continued with the methodical thoroughness of someone who'd spent years contemplating apocalypse until horror became merely data requiring accurate presentation. Each missile carried a warhead yielding approximately 1 megaton, roughly 50 times more powerful than the bomb that erased Hiroshima from existence in a single blinding moment that still haunted Japan's collective memory. The initial blast would obliterate everything within a 2-mile radius instantaneously, buildings collapsing into atomic wind, moving faster than sound. Concrete and steel rendered into constituent atoms scattered across superheated air. Beyond that immediate circle of total destruction, the thermal radiation would ignite fires across another 5 miles, creating firestorms that would consume oxygen faster than lungs could draw breath, suffocating survivors who'd escaped the initial blast only to die slower deaths. Kennedy's hands tightened around his cup as McCone described fallout patterns dependent on wind direction, radioactive particles drifting across the eastern seaboard like invisible poison, contaminating water supplies and agricultural land for generations yet unborn. The other XCOM members sat frozen as McCone detailed casualties projected for various target scenarios, numbers so vast they transcended comprehension and became abstract again despite his efforts toward precision. A coordinated strike against America's major population centers could kill 80 million people in the first 72 hours, more than double the entire death toll of World War II, compressed into a long weekend of atomic fire. Robert Kennedy scribbled notes with increasing violence, his pen tearing through paper as though physical action might somehow discharge the helpless fury building in that room, while civilization's potential ending received statistical analysis. Dean Rusk's normally ruddy complexion had turned ashen, one hand pressed against his chest as though checking his heart still functioned. While contemplating its possible vaporization, McNamara asked technical questions about missile readiness and launch protocols, retreating into systems analysis because the alternative was confronting emotions too overwhelming for any defense mechanism to adequately contain. Kennedy finally interrupted the briefing, his voice cutting through. McCone's recitation with quiet intensity that commanded immediate silence, despite containing no raised volume or obvious anger. Gentlemen, let's be absolutely clear about what we're discussing. These aren't military targets or strategic assets, but American families eating breakfast without knowing their continued existence depends on decisions we make in this room over the next few days. The shift from abstract planning to human reality hung in the air like McCone's cigarette smoke, forcing everyone present to acknowledge that behind every statistic lived someone's daughter, someone's grandfather. entire futures that could be erased because two governments couldn't find diplomatic solutions to geopolitical chess games. Kennedy's gaze moved across each face at the table, ensuring they understood that whatever course they recommended, whatever action they counseled or caution they advised, the consequences would be measured in actual lives rather than theoretical models. The morning had transformed their crisis from political challenge into moral test, and the weight of that recognition settled across the cabinet room like fallout drifting on winds no one could predict or control. Kennedy stood at the window overlooking the rose garden, his reflection ghosted against glass that separated deliberation from action, the impossible choice crystallizing with each passing moment as his military advisors pushed harder for immediate airstrikes. General Curtis LeMay's gravelly voice filled the cabinet room behind him, painting swift military action as America's only credible response, arguing that hesitation would signal weakness to Moscow and embolden Soviet aggression across every flashpoint from Berlin to Southeast Asia. The logic possessed terrible simplicity: destroy the missiles before they became operational, eliminate the threat through overwhelming force applied with surgical precision, restore the strategic balance through action rather than negotiation. Kennedy's jaw tightened as he listened, recognizing the seductive clarity of military solutions that transformed complex geopolitical tangles into target coordinates and strike packages. Yet somewhere beneath that surface appeal lurked the ghost of August 1914, when confident generals assured anxious monarchs that quick victories awaited, that mobilization meant security rather than catastrophe, that war could be controlled and contained through superior planning. The parallels haunted Kennedy with increasing urgency as XCOM continued debating strike options, his recent reading of Tuchman's account bleeding into present circumstances with uncomfortable precision. European powers had stumbled into World War I through accumulated miscalculations and rigid mobilization schedules that transformed a Balkan assassination into continental slaughter, each side certain their actions represented necessary defense, while collectively creating exactly the conflagration everyone claimed to want avoiding. Kennedy turned from the window, studying the faces around the table. Intelligent men, patriotic men, yet potentially capable of the same catastrophic certainty that had killed millions in trenches stretching across French countryside. LeMay insisted the Soviets would accept American airstrikes without retaliation, that Khrushchev understood superior force and would back down when confronted decisively. But what if LeMay was wrong? What if Soviet officers in Cuba responded to American bombers with exactly the aggressive defense their training demanded, creating escalation spirals neither capital could control? Kennedy's internal struggle manifested in tightening fingers against his lower back, chronic pain flaring as psychological tension found physical expression through damaged vertebrae that never properly healed. His instincts screamed for action, for striking back against Khrushchev's deception with the overwhelming military superiority America possessed, for proving that Soviet adventurism carried consequences rather than rewards. The humiliation of the Bay of Pigs still burned in memory, critics questioning his resolve and toughness, conservatives suggesting he lacked the steel necessary for effective Cold War leadership. An airstrike would silence those doubts instantly, demonstrating decisive leadership while eliminating the immediate nuclear threat through American technological and military dominance. Yet beneath that visceral urge toward action ran deeper currents of caution, born from studying how previous wars began, not through careful planning, but through cascading miscalculations where each side believed they controlled events until events controlled them. The president returned to his chair, the leather creaking as he settled into position at the table's head, his voice quiet but absolutely firm when he finally spoke into the continuing debate surrounding military options. "Gentlemen, I will not be the American president who repeats Europe's mistakes by letting military momentum override careful thought. We will find another way forward, even if it takes longer and feels less satisfying than bombs falling on Cuban soil. The words settled across the cabinet room like a verdict against history's repetition. Kennedy choosing the harder path of restraint over the seductive simplicity of strike orders, gambling that patience and creativity might achieve what firepower would only complicate. The decision made, Kennedy felt the weight multiply rather than lift, knowing that choosing not to act carried its own terrible risks if he'd miscalculated Soviet intentions or underestimated the threat those missiles represented to American security. The grandfather clock in the White House residence struck past midnight as Kennedy sat alone in the second-floor study, a single brass lamp casting amber light across the pages of Barbara Tuchman's The Guns of August, his reading glasses reflecting golden pools that flickered with each turn of worn paper. The leather armchair embraced him like a confessor's booth as he absorbed accounts of European leaders sleepwalking into catastrophe during the summer of 1914, their certainties and miscalculations, transforming a Balkan crisis into mechanized slaughter that consumed an entire generation. Outside his window, Washington stretched dark and peaceful beneath October stars, millions sleeping unaware that their president wrestled with parallels between past and present that grew more disturbing with each chapter. Kennedy's finger traced passages, describing Kaiser Wilhelm's conviction that Russia wouldn't dare mobilize, Tsar Nicholas's belief that partial mobilization could remain controlled, each sovereign certain they understood their opponent's limits until events proved otherwise. The coincidence of dates haunted him. Cuba in October, Europe in August, both crises unfolding during months when summer confidence met autumn consequences, when leaders discovered too late that wars began not through evil intentions, but through accumulated misjudgments no single actor could reverse. The book's central thesis penetrated Kennedy's thoughts with uncomfortable precision as he read Tuchman's account of mobilization schedules becoming irreversible, military timetables transforming diplomatic options into mechanical inevitabilities that politicians couldn't stop once generals set armies marching toward predetermined positions. He recognized that same dangerous momentum in LeMay's arguments for immediate airstrikes. The seductive logic of military calendars that insisted action must come now, today, this hour, before Soviet technicians completed missile installations and shifted strategic balances beyond American correction. Kennedy removed his glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose where tension gathered like storm clouds, understanding that Khrushchev likely faced similar pressures in Moscow, Soviet generals insisting their missiles provided necessary deterrence, advisors warning that backing down would signal weakness throughout the communist world. The space between their two positions seemed impossibly narrow, compressed by institutional forces neither man fully controlled, both capitals trapped in escalation patterns that resembled 1914 more than either side would publicly admit. A soft knock interrupted Kennedy's reading as Jackie entered carrying chamomile tea, her silk dressing gown whispering across the study's oriental carpet, concern etched in features that recognized her husband's particular quality of worry that transcended ordinary presidential stress. She set the cup beside Tuchman's book without speaking, her hand briefly touching Kennedy's shoulder in solidarity that required no words, understanding that some burdens couldn't be shared no matter how intimate the relationship. Kennedy caught her hand momentarily, drawing strength from the contact before releasing her to return to their bedroom, his isolation fundamentally complete despite her presence in the adjacent room. The tea cooled untouched as he returned to reading about Austro-Hungarian ultimatums and Russian mobilizations, searching Tuchman's prose for lessons that might prevent October 1962 from becoming another August 1914. Kennedy finally closed the book near 3 in the morning, his decision crystallizing through historical reflection rather than military briefings, understanding that his greatest responsibility involved preventing escalation rather than winning confrontation through superior force applied with righteous confidence. The correlation between 1914 and 1962, the first light of dawn crept through the study windows as Kennedy descended the residence stairs toward the Oval Office, each footfall measured and deliberate, like a man approaching an executioner's platform, carrying Tuckman's book pressed against his chest, where its lessons burned through fabric into flesh. The Secret Service agents stationed throughout the corridor registered their president's haunted expression, but maintained professional distance, recognizing something transformative had occurred during those solitary midnight hours that separated the man who entered the study from the leader now emerging. Kennedy paused at the threshold of the West Wing, drawing breath that tasted metallic with consequence, understanding that 13 days stretched ahead like a tightrope suspended between civilization and annihilation, each decision either guiding humanity back towards solid ground or plunging everyone into the abyss that swallowed Europe in 1914. The morning briefing papers waited on his desk beside classified photographs of Cuban missile sites, their deadly geometry unchanged from yesterday, but somehow different now, transformed from provocation, demanding response, into puzzle, requiring solution that preserved both American security and human survival. Kennedy summoned his speechwriters at 7 that morning, his instructions precise and unyielding as he outlined the address that would inform Americans their world had fundamentally changed overnight, that Soviet deception had placed nuclear annihilation within minutes of Miami, Atlanta, Washington itself. Ted Sorensen's pencil scratched across yellow legal pads as Kennedy dictated not threats but measured determination, rejecting the inflammatory rhetoric his military advisers recommended in favor of language that left Khrushchev diplomatic space to retreat without humiliation that might force desperate choices. The speech took shape through multiple drafts, each revision calibrated to communicate American resolve without triggering Soviet countermeasures, walking the razor's edge between weakness that invited further aggression and strength that provoked nuclear exchange neither superpower could survive. Kennedy's editorial changes reflected his midnight reading, removing ultimatums that echoed Austro-Hungarian rigidity in 1914, inserting phrases that acknowledged mutual danger rather than unilateral demands. The television cameras arrived at the Oval Office as October afternoon shadows lengthened across the South Lawn, technicians arranging lights that would carry Kennedy's image into 70 million American homes, where families gathered around dinner tables unaware their evening routine was about to shatter, like crystal dropped on marble. Kennedy sat motionless during sound checks, conserving emotional energy for the performance ahead, knowing his facial expressions and vocal tone mattered as much as his carefully constructed words, that appearing too aggressive risked panic, while seeming too passive invited Soviet exploitation. The makeup artist applied powder to reduce the shine, under hot studio lights, while Kennedy reviewed his speech a final time, marking pauses for emphasis, underlining phrases requiring particular gravitas, transforming typed text into spoken performance that would define his presidency and possibly humanity's future. The stage manager's countdown echoed through the Oval Office as Kennedy straightened his tie and looked directly into the camera lens that connected him to the nation. His opening words carried the weight of historical consciousness as he announced the missile discovery, his Boston accent flattened by the gravity of information that transformed abstract Cold War tensions into immediate existential threat, requiring American unity and international resolve. Kennedy's hands remained steady on the desk as he outlined the naval quarantine, carefully avoiding the word blockade with its connotations of acts of war. his phrasing deliberate and legal, establishing justification while leaving negotiation pathways open for Soviet retreat that could save Khrushchev's face and everyone's lives. The speech concluded not with triumph, but warning, acknowledging the dangerous road ahead, while expressing confidence that American determination combined with restraint would navigate the crisis toward peaceful resolution rather than nuclear catastrophe. As the cameras powered down and technicians dismantled their equipment, Kennedy sat alone in the darkened Oval Office, having spoken his piece to the nation and the world, now waiting to discover whether his words would guide humanity back from the brink or merely serve as prologue to the final chapter of human civilization. What would you have done if you were Kennedy facing nuclear war? Subscribe to explore more moments that changed history forever.